so the question about why I work with subliminal archives, I think actually in my book Immaterial Bodies, I think at some point I call them transliminal, because I was thinking about the idea that these archives, often we think of archives as being in the past, but I wanted to think about how the archives I was interested in might speak to contemporary psychology, and also I think haunt contemporary psychology in terms of the kinds of subjectivity that the psychological sciences tend to validate and authenticate and authorise. So I was thinking of the notion of trans as being something that enables us to think about how archives can move from one context into another. And I see my role really as kind of actively intervening in order to stage those movements between past and present, in order to really foreground experiences that have been marginalised or pathologised within psychology, but I think really can tell us something really important about who and what we are as subjects in different contexts. So to move beyond any kind of pathologisation or marginalisation. Yeah, and these archives aren't always easy to find either. So some of the material that I've worked with has really been consigned to the past, or appears often in histories of psychology as some moment in time where psychologists weren't the rational scientists that they are now, you know, and was seduced or even deluded by particular ideas that you know, it might be possible for telepathy or ideas of telepathy to be kind of important ways of thinking about what it might mean to experiment with the improbable or the imperceptible. So I always take it as a challenge to respond to those ideas and try and say something that returns the meaning to these phenomena in new ways. Mm-hmm. I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, I wanted to use the term immateriality because often if you know, for example, if you Google the term immateriality, it's often used to refer to the soul as something that precisely is a disembodied process or entity. And I wanted to bring the immaterial back to contemporary discussions of materiality that we might find in new materialism, because I think, for me at least, some of the kinds of approaches to materiality within new materialism kind of disavow any notion of a psyche or some kind of psychic or psychological attunement, and are in danger of reifying a kind of neurophysiological body. So it's a sort of provocation really to say, well, you know, it's all fine to talk about materiality, but that is in danger of reintroducing a very flat ontology that can become quite behaviourist. And I think some of the work in affect studies has that danger when you know, there's a relationship made between power and the autonomic nervous system, for example, to talk about affective modes of governance. And I you know, I want to think about and retain a way of thinking about subjectivity transversely that has an immateriality to it. So I guess, in a way, if it had looked more attractive for the publisher, I might have had a slash, so it might have been im and then materiality, but they weren't happy with that. So I don't see kind of work really dealing with the complexity of that, and I think it's really, really important for lots of reasons I've argued, but because, you know, we have to, if we're going to talk about materiality, I think we also have to consider one of the key knowledge practices, i.e. psychology, which has also proliferated modes of understanding and practices which move across the kind of biological and the psychological, because, you know, psychology draws from the biological and physiological sciences as much as it does from, you know, social psychology and work that perhaps bridges more of a gap with cultural studies and queer theory and so on. So, yeah, the immaterial is important for me, but in no way do I want to suggest that the immaterial is disembodied. It's, you know, I absolutely want to think of it in an embodied way that opens up to, you know, even the question of what counts as a body. It was just when I started my PhD, which was in 1990, and I met Nicholas Rose, a critical sociologist, and I had an interview with him, and he said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "I want to do a genealogy or an archaeology, Foucauldian archaeology of to explore how it's become possible for hearing voices to be considered a first-rank symptom of schizophrenia." He said, "Okay, that sounds like a good question." And just at that very moment, quite serendipitously, and I can't actually remember how, but I became aware of the very first Hearing Voices group in the UK that was being set up in Manchester. And I made a connection with Terence McLaughlin, who was a very active member of the network in its infancy, who's sadly now died. So many of the early voice hearers I work with have later died, actually often from the long-term toxic effects of pharmaceuticals. But I made contact with Terence and said I was really interested in the network and what they were doing, and that I'd always wanted my research to be collaborative and to be of use to activists and you know, mental health users. So I kind of wanted to work with them and see if there was a way in which we could work together. And that really met the ethos of the network, particularly as it started, because they wanted to work with, as they called it, professionals who were willing to listen and academics who were willing to listen to what they wanted to do, because they realised that actually they needed to develop, as part of their networks, new forms of knowledge that would inform, you know, how the practices that they were crafting and developing could be understood and circulated amongst wider communities. So I took part in the first Hearing Voices conference in the UK, which I think was in 1992, and so spoke about my research, but also very, very early on in my own research, I worked with and met hearing voices, voice hearers from the Manchester group, and then was invited to do an ethnography of the groups, because they were, you know, they were developing practices that they could see were efficacious, and they wanted to try and understand what might be going on in those processes of transformation. So actually the kinds of theories that I was working with were really useful. So there's always been this sort of synergy and interchange between the network and the kinds of critical mental health research and research that I've been doing, which has gone from the beginnings of the network in the UK through to this big Wellcome funded grant for, it's called the Hearing the Voice Project, which sort of maintains the collaboration between voice hearers, professionals, activists, and is trying to really develop and enhance the network even further, because of the success of the network and the peer-to-peer sort of what's called peer-to-peer communication within the network. So yeah, just sort of serendipitous, but yeah, my work wouldn't be possible without the network, and I just think everything I try and do is embedded in the sorts of experiences and people I've worked with.